What would you do if everyone who was supposed to protect you just walked away? June 14th, 1973, arrived like any other Iowa evening. The sun hung low over Grundy Center, turning the sky into shades of copper and violet that would have been beautiful if Michael Thompson had been in any position to notice. He stood on County Road 20 with a duffel bag at his feet, the fabric worn thin from years of being shoved into closets and dragged across bedroom floors. Inside it sat everything he owned now: 3 shirts folded tight, 2 pairs of jeans, work boots with the left sole starting to separate a jacket too light for winter, and a handful of notebooks from high school that he'd kept because throwing them away felt like admitting he'd never amount to anything. He was 17 years old, legally old enough to be told to leave, young enough to have absolutely no idea what came next. $47 sat in his front pocket. Not 50, not enough to feel remotely secure, just enough to understand exactly how close he was to nothing. The word still echoed in his skull, sharp and final, delivered in the flat tone his stepfather, Edward Harris, used when he wanted to make something sound like an undeniable fact rather than a choice. "You're not my kid. You're old enough now. Get out." Edward hadn't raised his voice. That was what made it worse. He'd said it the way someone might comment on the weather or the price of corn, like he was explaining something Michael should have already understood. Michael's mother, Linda, had stood behind Edward in the doorway, hands shaking at her sides, eyes red from crying so quietly it barely registered as sound. She didn't argue. She didn't step between them. She didn't say Edward's name in that warning tone wives use when their husbands are about to cross a line. She just watched as Edward shoved Michael's belongings into the duffel bag and pushed him toward the door with one hand on his shoulder blade. Michael had turned once, just once, hoping she would say his name, hoping she would do something, anything, to prove that 17 years of being her son meant more than whatever hold Edward had over her. She didn't. Her mouth opened slightly, like words were forming somewhere behind her teeth, but nothing came out. The door closed. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't slam. It was just a soft click of the latch catching, and somehow that made it final in a way shouting never could have. Now he stood alone. The road stretched in both directions, fields of corn not yet tall enough to hide in on either side. He didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come, even if he'd wanted them to. Panic rose and fell in waves, instead tightening his chest until breathing took effort. No car, no job lined up, no family willing to take him in, no plan that extended past getting through the next hour. He checked his pocket again, even though he already knew what was there. $47. He could buy a meal, maybe 2, if he chose carefully. He could buy a night in the cheapest motel if he found one that didn't ask questions about age. He couldn't buy a future. He couldn't buy a place in the world. Cars passed. Most didn't slow down. A few drivers glanced at him and looked away quickly, the way people do when they see something they'd rather not acknowledge. One truck slowed to about 20 miles per hour, the driver leaning forward to get a better look, then accelerated away as if deciding against getting involved. Each vehicle that passed made the silence heavier. Michael wondered how long he could stand there before it got dark enough that no one would see him at all. He wondered if this was what disappearing felt like. Then a pickup truck rattled into view. The paint had faded from whatever color it used to be into something between rust and resignation. The engine didn't purr. It coughed and rumbled like it had been running on determination alone for the last decade. The truck slowed and pulled onto the gravel shoulder dust rising around the tires in the golden light. The driver leaned across the bench seat and cranked down the passenger window by hand. The man was old, late 60s at least. His face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent every day of his life outdoors, skin creased in patterns that told stories about sun and wind and hard winters. His eyes, though, held something Michael hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not suspicion, just a kind of tired recognition, like he'd seen this exact scene before and knew how it ended if nobody stopped. "You need a ride, son?" The words were simple, no demand for explanation, no interrogation about why a kid was standing on the side of the road with everything he owned in one bag. Just an offer. Michael nodded before fear could convince him to say no. He grabbed the duffel bag and climbed in. The inside of the truck smelled like motor oil and dirt and something familiar he couldn't quite name. It made his shoulders drop just slightly, the first easing of tension he'd felt in hours. They drove for several miles without talking. The engine hummed in that uneven way old vehicles do. The road unwound ahead of them. Michael stared out the window, waiting for the questions he knew were coming. Eventually, the man spoke again, his voice carrying the blunt edge of someone who didn't waste words. "Where you headed?" Michael swallowed. The truth sat bitter on his tongue. "I don't know." The truck kept moving. The man nodded like that was answer enough for now. "You got family somewhere?" "No, sir." Another pause, longer this time. "How old are you?" 17. "You just graduate. Last month." The man's hands stayed steady on the wheel. Michael could feel him adding things up, putting together a picture from the gaps in the conversation. Eventually, he asked the question Michael had been dreading. "You got a job?" "No, sir." "Any skills?" Michael hesitated. He didn't know how to sell himself. He'd worked odd jobs around Grundy Center, helped neighbors with fencing and hay baling, fixed a few lawn mowers when people couldn't afford the repair shop. But none of that felt like skills worth mentioning to a stranger. Finally, he said what felt closest to the truth. "I can work. I'm strong. I learn fast." The man didn't answer right away. The silence stretched again, but it didn't feel quite as heavy this time. After another mile, he spoke. "Name's Robert Williams." He nodded toward the road ahead. "I've got a farm, 400 acres, corn and beans. I'm getting old. Need help. Can't pay much." Michael's heart started beating faster, harder, like it was trying to remind him this might be the only chance he got. $80 a week. You can sleep in the equipment barn for now. We'll figure something better out later. Something hot and sudden rose in Michael's throat. Gratitude mixed with relief, mixed with terror that he might say the wrong thing and lose this before it even started. He nodded hard, maybe too hard. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Robert glanced at him, then back at the road. "We'll see how it goes." And, just like that, Michael Thompson went from a kid with nowhere to go to someone with work waiting at the end of the drive. It wasn't much. It wasn't safe or permanent or anything close to a real home. But it was more than he had had 20 minutes ago, and right now that felt like everything. The farm wasn't the kind of place anyone would describe as beautiful. It was functional. Fields stretched out in every direction, equipment parked where it had been left, buildings standing, but showing their age in peeling paint and sagging roof lines. Robert showed him where he'd sleep without ceremony or apology. The equipment barn wasn't heated. It wasn't insulated. It was a massive metal structure that housed tractors and combines and tools, and in one corner, someone had cleared out just enough space for a cot, a small wooden table, and a space heater that looked older than Michael felt. "This'll do." Michael looked at the corner. The cot had a thin mattress and a wool blanket folded at the foot. The table held a lamp with a crooked shade. The concrete floor had been swept clean, but still carried decades of oil stains and dirt ground into the surface. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comfortable. It was dry and safe and more than he'd had an hour earlier. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Robert nodded once. "Come up to the house at 5 tomorrow morning. I'll show you what needs doing." Then he left. Michael stood in the barn, surrounded by machines that loomed in the dim light like sleeping giants. He set his duffel bag on the cot and sat down beside it. The metal building creaked as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Somewhere outside, cattle lowed in the evening stillness. Michael lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling, at the exposed beams, and the underside of the metal roof, and tried to process what his life had become in the span of a single day. He didn't let himself think about his mother. That hurt in a way that made his chest tight and his breathing shallow. He focused on the work instead, on the fact that tomorrow morning he'd have something to do, somewhere to be, someone expecting him to show up. He reached into his pocket and felt the bills there. $47, all he had in the world. He folded them carefully and tucked them under the thin mattress. Then he pulled the wool blanket over himself and closed his eyes, listening to the barn settle around him. The next morning started before sunrise. Robert didn't give speeches or motivational talks. He showed Michael what needed doing and expected him to do it. Feed the cattle, clean the pens, haul equipment from one field to another, fix small things that broke. The work was constant and physical in a way that left Michael's hands sore and his back aching by the end of the first day. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for breaks. He worked like someone who understood this was his only shot. Robert noticed. Within the first week, he trusted Michael with machinery, let him drive tractors across fields, let him operate equipment that cost more than Michael could imagine earning in his lifetime. Michael soaked it all in. He asked questions when he didn't understand something. He stayed quiet and watched when he did. At night, he lay on the cot listening to the wind move through the barn, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what his life had been a month ago and what it might become now. By August, he'd saved $940. Robert let him borrow an old 1960 Chevy pickup that barely ran. The engine knocked. The transmission slipped between gears. The brakes needed pumping twice before they caught. Michael spent his evenings learning how it worked, fixing what he could with salvaged parts and borrowed tools. He read repair manuals by lamplight in the barn. He learned about timing belts and carburetors and fuel pumps the way other kids his age learned about college majors and career paths. One Saturday in September, he sat in the barn, flipping through the Grundy Register newspaper Robert had left on the table. Most of it was local news he didn't care about. Ads for farm equipment he couldn't afford. Obituaries for people he'd never known. Then he saw it. A small classified ad, just 3 lines in the agricultural section. Farmall H tractor for sale. Needs work. $100. Most people would have skipped right past it. A tractor that needed work meant a tractor that probably didn't run. $100 for something broken was either a bargain or a mistake, and most people would assume mistake. Michael read it again, then again. He folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into his back pocket, his mind already racing ahead to something he couldn't fully explain yet. That night he lay on the cot doing math in his head. $940 saved. 100 would take a significant chunk out of that safety net. He'd be left with 840, less than 1,000. One bad month, one injury, one mistake, and he'd be back to nothing. But something about the ad wouldn't let go. He thought about risk and fear and what it meant to own something. Really own it. Something no one could take away from him. The next morning, he picked up the phone in Robert's kitchen and dialed the number from the ad. An old man answered. Voice rough, blunt, the kind that didn't waste time on pleasantries. You calling about the tractor Michael said he was? The man gave him an address. Michael hung up his hand, shaking slightly. He reached into his pocket and felt the worn bills there. $47 had been all he'd had when he stood on County Road 20. Now he was about to spend $100 on something everyone else had already given up on. He didn't know if it would work. He only knew one thing for certain. He was willing to work. The address took him 20 minutes down roads that got progressively smaller and less maintained. He pulled into a yard where an old shed slumped slightly to one side, boards gray with age and neglect. An elderly man stepped out onto the porch, thin but not fragile, slow but deliberate. He had the look of someone who'd spent his entire life doing hard physical labor and was only now allowing time to catch him. You, the kid on the phone. Yes, sir. Michael Thompson. George White. The man motioned toward the shed without offering his hand. It's in there. They walked across the packed dirt yard. Dust rose with each step and hung in the still air. Inside the shed, the temperature dropped, and the smell hit immediately. Old hay mixed with rust and stale fuel, and there it sat. The Farmall H, 1948. The red paint had faded toward brown. Rust crawled along the metal like a disease spreading slowly from every joint and seam. The tires were flat and cracked. The seat was torn, foam spilling out. The engine block was thick with grime and cobwebs. It looked less like a machine and more like something that had been forgotten so long it had stopped expecting to be needed again. Michael stood still, taking it in, feeling that strange mix of disappointment and possibility that comes when you see something broken but not beyond saving. George watched him closely, reading his face. Bought it new in 48. Ran it for 20 years. Used it till 68. Then I got newer equipment. This one just sat. Engine seized. Hasn't turned over in 5 years at least. Michael walked around it slowly, his hand hovering near the metal like he was afraid it would crumble if he touched it. He crouched near the engine and looked at the belts, the fuel lines, the carburetor. He didn't pretend he knew everything, but he knew enough to see what was broken and what might be fixable. Why you selling it for 100? George gave a tired shrug. Because I don't have the energy to fix it, and I don't want to die with it still sitting here taking up space. I just want it gone. He leaned against the doorframe. You really want this thing? Michael opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Something had caught his eye. On the right side of the engine block, almost hidden under layers of grease and dirt, someone had scratched letters into the metal, small, careful, deliberate. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. J.W., 1948. His breath caught. James Walker, his father's name, his father's initials. You knew my father. George looked at him differently then, recognition shifting into something heavier. Jim Walker was your father. Michael nodded, throat too tight for words. George exhaled slowly. Your last name Thompson. Right. Your mother remarried Harris. He walked over to the tractor and put his hand on the hood. I bought this from Jim's widow in '68. Your mother, after the accident. Michael's hands started shaking, the hydraulic failure, the one that killed him. George nodded. Wasn't the tractor's fault. Was a tired man making mistakes. Jim had been working doubles to keep the farm afloat. Fell asleep at the wheel, tractor rolled in a ditch, hydraulics failed and pinned him. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. George looked at Michael for a long moment. You would have been 5 years old. Michael remembered the funeral, but not much else. He remembered his mother crying for weeks. He remembered Edward Harris showing up 6 months later, offering stability and a future. He remembered the day his last name changed from Walker to Thompson when Linda remarried, but kept calling him Michael Walker in private, until eventually she stopped doing even that. I'll take it. The words came out steady, more certain than anything Michael had said in months. I'll give you 100 if you let me work on it here until I get it running. Then I'll haul it away. George's eyebrows lifted slightly. You think you can get it running? Michael didn't look away. I can try. George stared at him for a long second, then nodded once. Deal. Michael's fingers fumbled slightly as he pulled the bills from his pocket. $100 in worn cash. When George took it, Michael felt his stomach dip like he'd just stepped off a ledge. George folded the money and put it away without counting. You need tools. Michael hesitated, then admitted the truth. I've got access to some at Robert Williams's place. I'll bring what I can. I'll figure out the rest. George grunted. There's an old workbench and a vise in the corner. Use what you need. Just don't burn my shed down. Michael almost smiled. Yes, sir. He stood there after George left, alone with the tractor. His father's tractor, the machine Jim Walker had bought new in 1948, the one he'd worked for 20 years. Michael reached out and touched the metal cold under his palm. He thought about fate and coincidence, and whether there was a difference. He thought about standing on County Road 20 with $47 and how every choice since then had led him here to this shed with this machine. It felt like something bigger than luck. It felt like he'd been heading toward this moment his whole life without knowing it. That evening, Michael returned to the shed with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in paper. He didn't do much. He didn't rush. He pulled the spark plugs and looked into the cylinders, dry and rusty. He tried turning the engine by hand. Nothing. Locked solid. He didn't panic. He'd seen stuck bolts and frozen parts before. He fetched penetrating oil from Robert's barn and poured it slowly, carefully into each cylinder, letting it soak. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stared at the tractor again, thinking about the absurdity of it. A kid with no family sleeping in an equipment barn trying to resurrect a dead machine because something in him needed proof that broken things could move again. He was packing up to leave when he heard footsteps. A young woman appeared in the shed doorway, silhouetted against the evening light. She held 2 mugs of coffee and looked at him with curiosity that felt genuine rather than intrusive. Dad says you bought the red beast. Michael stood suddenly aware of how dirty he was. Grease on his hands, oil stains on his shirt, going to fix it. She walked closer, handed him one of the mugs. "I'm Laura, Laura White. George is my dad." She sat on the workbench completely at ease in work boots and jeans. Why would anyone buy a tractor that doesn't run? Michael wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth. "Because it was my father's." Laura's expression shifted. Something softened in her eyes, the understanding that comes from loss rather than sympathy. "My mom died when I was 10. Dad raised me alone after that." She looked at the tractor. "I know what it's like when the people who should stay don't get to, and when the ones who should have stayed chose to leave instead." Michael didn't know what to say to that. Laura didn't seem to expect a response. She took a sip of coffee. "I'm studying accounting at community college. Come home on weekends to help Dad." She gestured at the tractor. "If you want help on weekends, I know my way around an engine." Michael looked at her, trying to figure out if she was serious. "Why would you help?" Laura met his eyes. "Because you're trying to save something everyone else gave up on. That's rare." She finished her coffee and set the mug down. "I'll see you next Sunday." She left before Michael could respond. He stood there, holding the coffee, feeling like something had shifted in a way he didn't quite understand yet. He'd come here for a tractor. He hadn't expected to find someone who seemed to understand why it mattered. The next 6 Sundays became a ritual. Michael would arrive early with his thermos and his tools. Laura would show up mid-morning with food and more tools and a willingness to get her hands dirty that surprised him every time. They worked side by side, Michael teaching himself as much as doing Laura, offering suggestions when he got stuck. The first 2 weeks were nothing but soaking and waiting and gentle force. Michael would tap and wiggle and apply pressure, then stop and breathe and do it again. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow and stubborn and boring in the way real work is, the kind of boring that makes most people quit because they don't get rewarded fast enough. Michael didn't quit. He couldn't afford to. Not after putting that 100 down, not after learning this had been his father's machine. After 2 weeks, he felt it, just the slightest movement in the engine, like a door locked for years, suddenly cracking open by a hair. He froze, afraid it was his imagination. He tried again carefully. There, a tiny shift. Michael sat back on his heels and let himself breathe. Laura, holding a flashlight for him, saw the look on his face. "You got it. Beginning to move." She grinned. "Told you." By week 3, the pistons were working free bit by bit. Michael cleaned the fuel system, stripped the lines, flushed what he could. He pulled the carburetor and laid the parts out on an old rag, like he was performing surgery. He bought a $15 rebuild kit with money from his wages and handled each tiny piece with care. He scrubbed corrosion with a wire brush until his knuckles were raw. He replaced the spark plugs. He overhauled the magneto. That part, everyone said, was too complicated for someone without formal training. Michael learned it by taking it apart and putting it back together and taking it apart again when it didn't work, and trying again until it did. When something fought him, he didn't curse the tractor. He just stared at it longer, like he was daring it to outlast him. Laura watched him work with something close to admiration. "You don't give up, do you?" "Can't afford to." By week 4, the tires became the problem. George had been right. They were shot, flat and cracked and stiff as old leather. Michael drove to a salvage yard and walked through piles of discarded rubber until he found 4 used tires that would fit. $40 for all 4. He loaded them himself, sweat soaking through his shirt. Back at the shed, he mounted them one at a time, wrestling each like it was alive and fighting him. The tractor started looking less like a corpse and more like a machine with potential. Week 5. Michael dealt with what everyone notices first: the rust, the faded paint, the ugliness that made people call it junk. He scraped off loose flakes, sanded where he could wipe the dust away. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He did it because the tractor deserved to look like it belonged in the world again. He bought primer and paint for $58. Harvester red. The kind of red that doesn't apologize or fade quietly. He primed and painted it in the shed, the smell sharp and chemical, the color bleeding back into the metal like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. George came in once while Michael was painting, stood in the doorway, watching. Didn't say much, but his eyes followed the brush strokes. Eventually, he spoke, voice quiet. "Jim would be proud of what you're doing." Michael's hand stopped mid-stroke. He didn't turn around. "Thank you, sir." Week 6 was the week Michael stopped thinking about money and started thinking about the moment. The moment it would either work or prove everyone right who'd called him foolish. He checked everything again: fuel line, carburetor, magneto, plugs, oil. He tightened bolts until his fingers cramped. He filled the tank with fresh fuel, just a little, because he didn't want to waste more if it failed. He sat in the torn seat and for a second just held the steering wheel, feeling how cold the metal was against his palms. He thought about Edward's voice, flat and dismissive. He thought about his mother crying without stopping it. He thought about County Road 20 at sunset and how empty the world had felt. Then he set his jaw, reached for the starter, and cranked. Nothing, not even a cough. His stomach dropped. He tried again. Still nothing. Heat rose behind his eyes, that old familiar humiliation creeping back, the sense that no matter how hard he worked, something would always be locked against him. He forced himself to stop, not because he was giving up, but because panic makes you miss what matters. He took a breath and checked the ignition again. A wire was loose, just loose enough to kill everything. He tightened it with shaking hands, then sat back down. This time he didn't rush. He cranked again. The engine turned, coughed once, like it was waking up, confused and irritated. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. He cranked again. Another cough, then a sputter, then a sound like the tractor was clearing its throat after years of silence. Then all at once it caught. The engine roared to life with a rough, uneven rumble that filled the shed and shook dust loose from the rafters. Smoke puffed out thick at first, then thinning. The tractor shuddered like it was remembering how to be alive. Michael sat there, hands gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead. His face was wet, and he hadn't even felt it start. Laura stood in the doorway, both hands over her mouth, tears streaming. George appeared behind her, arms crossed, watching, like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. Michael shut it down after a minute, afraid to push his luck. Then he started it again, just to prove the first time wasn't a dream. It roared back to life, rough but willing. Michael let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob at the same time. George stepped closer, voice quiet and almost respectful. "Well, I'll be damned." Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed and not embarrassed at all. "It runs." George nodded slowly. "You did real work, kid. Your dad would be proud." Michael looked at the tractor again, at the red paint still tacky in places, at the rust he hadn't gotten to yet, at the smoke lingering in the air. Something settled inside him, not pride exactly, something heavier, like a piece of him that had been broken had just clicked back into place. He didn't have a home, he didn't have a family that wanted him, but he had this. He had something he'd touched with his own hands and brought back from the dead. And for a kid who'd been told he didn't matter, that mattered more than he could explain. He hooked a chain to the tractor and hauled it out into the sunlight for the first time in years. The tires rolled over the dirt like they belonged there. He drove it slowly around the yard, listening to every sound, feeling every vibration. When he brought it back and shut it off, the quiet afterward felt impossible. Laura walked over, stood beside him as he climbed down. That was beautiful. Michael looked at her. "Thank you for helping." She smiled. "You did it yourself. I just held the flashlight." That evening, Michael drove the Farmall H back toward Robert's farm on a borrowed trailer, the tractor secured with chains, the sky turning the same colors it had the night Edward kicked him out. He pulled into the yard and parked, then stood there, staring at what he'd done, almost afraid Robert would say it was foolish. Robert came out, slow, hands in his pockets, and walked around the tractor with eyes that took in the fresh paint, the new tires, the fact that it stood ready instead of rotting. He didn't smile big. Robert wasn't the type. But he nodded once with weight. "That's good work, Michael. Real good." Michael swallowed hard. "Thanks." Robert looked at him, then at the tractor again. "What you going to do with it?" Michael didn't answer right away because the truth was he didn't fully know yet. He just knew the tractor wasn't the end. It was the first thing in his life that proved he could take something nobody wanted and make it useful again. He finally said it quiet but certain. "I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out." Robert studied him for a long moment. Then he turned toward the house. "Come inside. There's something we need to talk about." Winter came early that year. November arrived with winds that cut across Iowa like something with teeth, daring anyone to complain. By the time Michael turned 18 in mid-November, the equipment barn had stopped feeling like temporary shelter and started feeling like a test he needed to pass. The cot creaked when he shifted at night. The space heater hummed weakly, offering more noise than warmth. Some mornings he woke with frost on his blanket, his breath visible in the air, his hands so stiff it took effort just to pull on his boots. Iowa winters didn't care that he was young or alone or figuring things out as he went. They treated him the same way they treated everything else. He learned quickly that staying warm meant staying in motion. So he moved. Chores before dawn, work through whatever daylight the season offered, fixing things when they broke, learning what Robert showed him, puzzling out the rest on his own. At night, when his body finally gave out, he'd lie on the cot staring into the dark, listening to the building creak and the wind push against the walls, thinking about how thin the line was between having something and losing everything. He didn't talk about the cold. He didn't ask for better accommodations. Robert was fair but not sentimental, and Michael didn't want to risk sounding ungrateful. Instead, he endured. Some nights he sat near the heater with farming magazines Robert had given him, reading about crop rotation and soil management and equipment maintenance, words and ideas he'd never needed before but now clung to like instructions for staying alive. Other nights he thought about his family, about whether Linda ever wondered where he was sleeping, whether she thought of him when she heard wind howl outside the house she shared with Edward. Most of the time, he decided wondering didn't change anything. The loneliness weighed more than the cold. Robert was 70, quiet, practical. He treated Michael fairly, but didn't talk much beyond what work required. There were days when Michael realized he hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone since sunrise. The silence became something physical, something he carried around in his chest. But the tractor helped. The Farmall H sat in its corner of the barn like proof that persistence mattered. On Sundays when he wasn't working, Robert's fields, Michael tinkered with it. Adjusted small things, kept it running clean, maintained it the way you would something you respected. Working on it gave his hands purpose and his mind somewhere to rest. It was therapy before he knew what therapy was. Laura came most Saturdays. She'd drive the 30 minutes from community college with soup or stew or whatever she'd cooked that week, and they'd sit in the barn talking about futures that felt both impossibly far away and close enough to touch. She told him about her accounting classes, about professors who couldn't understand why she wanted to come back to Grundy Center instead of chasing opportunities in Des Moines or Cedar Rapids. He told her about learning to read soil quality, about the satisfaction of fixing something broken, about the strange comfort of work that left you too tired to think. One Saturday in late November, she brought homemade bread and butter. They sat on overturned crates near the space heater, Michael's hands wrapped around a bowl of soup that sent steam curling into the cold air. Laura watched him eat with something gentle in her expression. "You're getting too thin." Michael shrugged. "Eating costs money. I'm saving." "For what?" He didn't have a clear answer. For security, maybe. For proof that he could build something that wouldn't disappear if someone decided they didn't want him around anymore. For whatever came next. "I don't know yet. Just seems important to have something set aside." Laura pulled her knees up to her chest. "I graduate in May, planning to work at Grundy Hospital. They need bookkeepers, and the pay's decent. You should go somewhere bigger. You're too smart for this small town." She looked at him directly, holding his gaze. "Maybe I like small towns. Maybe I like the people here." Something shifted in the air between them. Michael felt it, but didn't know what to do with it. He focused on his soup instead, the weight of her words settling somewhere he'd examine later when he was alone. Then December arrived, and everything changed. Robert started coughing in the second week, the kind of cough that sounds wrong from the beginning. Michael noticed, but Robert waved it off. "Just a cold. It'll pass." By the third week, the cough had deepened into something that made Robert short of breath. Michael found him leaning against a fence post one morning, wheezing face gray. That afternoon, an ambulance pulled into the yard, red lights flashing against new snow, and Michael watched them load Robert onto a stretcher with an oxygen mask covering half his face. The paramedic, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, turned to Michael as they prepared to leave. "You family?" "No, ma'am. I work for him. Is there family we should call? He has a nephew in Chicago, Brian Johnson. I don't have the number. We'll find it." She climbed into the ambulance. "You take care of things here, okay?" Michael nodded, throat too tight for words. The ambulance pulled away, lights still flashing, and suddenly the farm felt dangerous in its quiet. Robert was gone, and the responsibility didn't leave with him. 400 acres, 80 head of cattle, equipment that needed maintenance, fields that would need attention come spring. Michael stood in the yard watching snowfall and felt fear tighten in his chest like a fist closing. That evening he fed the cattle alone. The next morning he checked water lines and broke ice in troughs, and hauled hay in temperatures that made his lungs burn. He ran Robert's combine through its paces in the equipment barn, checking oil and belts and hydraulics, making sure everything would be ready when needed. He fixed a gate that had been hanging crooked for weeks. He reorganized the tool shed because having a task kept panic at bay. He slept 4 hours a night, ate whatever was fastest, pushed himself because letting things fall apart wasn't an option. Laura showed up that Saturday without warning, pulling into the yard in her father's truck. She climbed out, bundled in a winter coat, and looked at Michael standing by the cattle pen, exhaustion written in every line of his posture. "How bad is he?" "Pneumonia. They're keeping him at least 2 weeks." She walked closer. "How are you managing?" Michael gestured at the farm around them. "Doing what needs doing." Laura studied his face, reading what he wasn't saying. "Have you eaten today?" He tried to remember. Couldn't. Laura shook her head and headed for the house. "Come on, you're going to sit down and eat something hot? And then I'm helping with whatever's left." They fell into a rhythm after that. Laura came every evening after her morning classes, helping with feeding and equipment checks and the 100 small tasks farms demand in winter. She cooked meals in Robert's kitchen, while Michael finished chores, and they'd eat together at the table, too tired for much conversation, but grateful not to be alone. On the nights when the temperature dropped below zero, she'd stay late helping him bed down the cattle with extra straw, making sure water lines wouldn't freeze. One night they worked until almost midnight, getting a heifer through a difficult birth. Laura held the flashlight while Michael worked with steady hands he didn't know he had, talking to the animal in a low voice, guiding the calf into the world through sheer patient determination. When it was over, and the calf was breathing, and the mother was on her feet, they stood in the barn, catching their breath, both covered in blood and fluid and straw. Laura looked at him, something like wonder in her expression. "You just saved 2 lives." Michael wiped his face on his sleeve. "Had to. Can't afford to lose stock. That's not why you did it, though." Her voice was quiet, certain. "You did it because you care." He didn't argue. She was right, and they both knew it. She stepped closer and kissed him, then quick and sure, like she'd been waiting for the right moment, and decided this was it. When she pulled back, Michael stood frozen, afraid to move, in case the moment disappeared. "I'll see you tomorrow." She headed for her truck, leaving him standing in the barn with a new calf and a feeling he couldn't quite name. 3 weeks after the ambulance took Robert away, Michael heard a vehicle in the yard. He came out of the barn, expecting Laura, and found Robert instead, climbing slowly out of a neighbor's car. Thinner than before, moving carefully like his body had to negotiate with gravity, but alive. Michael's chest loosened, seeing him upright. Robert crossed the yard with deliberate steps, eyes taking in the farm. The cattle looked healthy. Equipment sat where it belonged. Nothing was broken or neglected or falling apart. He turned to Michael with an expression that held more than Michael knew how to interpret. "You kept it running. I did what was needed." Robert nodded slowly, something shifting in how he looked at Michael, like he was seeing someone different than the kid he'd picked up on County Road 20. "I owe you." Michael shook his head. "You gave me a chance when nobody else would." "We're even." "No." Robert's voice came out firm, despite the weakness in his body. "We're not. But we will be." Winter dragged on. February brought ice storms that coated everything in glass and made every step treacherous. March teased spring with a few warm days before snow returned for one last assault. But something had changed between Michael and Robert. A respect had formed that went beyond employer and worker. Robert asked Michael's opinion on equipment purchases, consulted him about crop planning, talked about the farm's future in ways that included Michael in the conversation. One afternoon in late March, Robert called him into the house. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting through the window, dust motes floating in the air. Robert folded his hands on the table, studying them for a moment before speaking. "I'm 70 years old. Can't farm the way I used to. My nephew Brian will inherit this place eventually, but he's a city lawyer. He'll sell it the day I'm gone." Michael listened, uncertain where this was heading. Robert met his eyes. "I want to make you an offer. How would you like to rent 80 acres from me? Farm it yourself." The words landed heavy. Michael stared at him, mind racing through calculations he couldn't quite grasp. "I don't have equipment, just that old Farmall." Robert nodded like he'd expected this. "That Farmall will handle 80 acres if you're patient with it." He named the terms: $1,000 a year, pay after harvest. "If you make it work, maybe we expand next year." Michael felt dizzy. The barn, the cold nights, the hours of work, the tractor, everything seemed to rush forward and crash into this moment. Why Robert's expression softened in a way Michael had rarely seen. "Because you remind me of your father, Jim. He was poor too, worked harder than anyone I knew. Somebody gave him a chance once. I'm giving you one." Michael tried to find words that measured up to what was being offered. Finally, he just nodded. "I'll do it." They shook hands across the table, grip firm, sealing something that felt bigger than either of them. Spring arrived fast after that. Michael borrowed Robert's planter and cultivator, hooked them to the Farmall H, and planted corn on 80 acres that were now, in some way that still felt unreal, his responsibility. He worked Robert's 400 acres during the day, then his own 80 in early mornings and late evenings. 5 hours of sleep became normal. Exhaustion became background noise he learned to ignore. Laura started coming to the fields after her shifts at the hospital where she'd begun working. She'd climb up on the tractor and ride with him, checking seed depth spotting problems. He'd missed keeping him company through the long hours. They talked about everything and nothing, about what they wanted from life, about fears they'd never voiced to anyone else, about whether two people could build something permanent when everything around them felt temporary. One evening in early May, they sat on the tailgate of Robert's truck, watching the sun go down over freshly planted fields. Laura leaned against Michael's shoulder, comfortable in a way that suggested this had become routine, without either of them deciding it should be. "You're going to make this work." Her voice carried certainty Michael didn't feel yet. "What if I don't? What if I fail and can't pay Robert back? Then we figure it out." Her hand found his, together. Michael let himself believe her just for that moment. Let himself imagine a future where failing didn't mean losing everything. But what nobody at that table knew was that Thomas had already contacted a real estate developer. He was planning to sell the farm the day he inherited it. The threat arrived in late May, wearing an expensive suit. Brian Johnson pulled into Robert's yard, driving a new Cadillac that looked obscene next to the work trucks and tractors. He climbed out, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether doors would open for him. 25 years old with a law degree and family connections and the kind of smooth charm that made Michael's teeth ache. Robert had invited him for dinner, wanting to maintain family connections despite the distance that geography and lifestyle had created. Michael cleaned up as best he could, changed into his least worn shirt, tried to look like he belonged at the table. Laura came too at Robert's insistence, and George White drove over as well, since Robert rarely had company worth the effort of cooking a real meal. Brian surveyed the house with barely concealed judgment, asked questions that sounded polite, but felt like assessments. How many acres under cultivation? What's the yield per acre? What's the property worth at current market rates? Robert answered patiently, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the calculating edge beneath Brian's interest. Over pot roast and potatoes, Brian turned his attention to Michael. "So, you're the kid Uncle Robert took in." "Working for wages," Michael kept his voice level. "I work for wages on this farm. I'm also renting 80 acres to farm on my own." Brian's eyebrows lifted. "That's ambitious. Most young farmers fail their first year. Margins are tight. One bad season and you're in debt for years." "I don't plan to fail. Nobody plans to fail." Brian cut his meat with precise movements. "But good intentions don't harvest crops. Experience matters. Education matters. Have you even graduated high school?" Laura's fork clinked against her plate harder than necessary. "Michael has more practical farming knowledge than most people with agriculture degrees. He rebuilt a Farmall H from nothing. He kept this entire farm running when Robert was hospitalized." Brian smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I'm sure he's very capable for someone his age. I'm just thinking practically about risk management. When Uncle Robert eventually passes, this land goes to family, real family. We'll want to maximize its value." He gestured at the room around them. "Development is coming to this area. In 10 years, this county will look very different." Robert set down his fork. "This is farmland, Brian. Has been for 3 generations. Will be for more if I have anything to say about it." "Of course, Uncle Robert." Brian's tone dripped concession that meant nothing. "I'm just thinking about your legacy, about making sure the family is taken care of." After dinner, Michael was loading dishes in the kitchen when he heard voices from the porch. Brian and Robert talking, the conversation drifting through the open window. "You're letting this kid farm 80 acres. What if he damages your equipment? What if he fails and can't pay rent? Then that's my risk to take." Robert's voice carried steel beneath the weariness. "You're being sentimental. I know you like the kid, but when you're gone, I'll need to make hard decisions about this property. Decisions based on economics, not charity." Michael's hands stilled in the dishwater. Laura appeared beside him, having heard it too. Her jaw was set, anger bright in her eyes. "He can't do that. This is your farm, your land, for now." Michael dried his hands slowly. "Robert's 70, Brian's 25, and healthy and next in line. Math doesn't care about who deserves what." They drove back to George's house in silence, Michael's mind churning through problems he couldn't solve. Brian Johnson represented everything Michael wasn't: education, family connections, legal rights to land. Michael only touched through Robert's generosity. One heart attack, one stroke, one bad fall, and everything Michael was building would belong to someone who saw it as nothing more than a development opportunity. But Laura had been right about one thing. Michael had learned from the tractor. Broken things could be fixed if you were willing to do the work. And nobody else's opinion mattered except the one you formed in the dark hours when you decided whether to give up or keep going. April bled into May. May stretched into June. The corn grew climbing toward sunlight with the kind of determination Michael understood in his bones. He walked the rows every evening after chores, checking for pests and disease and anything that might threaten what he'd planted. Laura walked with him, sometimes their hands finding each other between the green stalks, neither of them talking much because the work said everything that needed saying. Robert watched it all from his porch, getting stronger slowly, but never quite returning to what he'd been before the pneumonia. He'd sit in his chair with coffee growing cold in his hands, eyes tracking Michael's progress across the fields, seeing something that made him nod to himself, like confirming a theory. By July, the corn was waist-high and healthy. By August, it towered overhead, rustling in the breeze, the sound like whispered promises. Michael stood at the edge of his 80 acres on a clear evening and let himself imagine for the first time that this might actually work, that he might harvest successfully, that Brian Johnson and all the doubt in the world couldn't stop something that was already growing. Then September arrived, and harvest loomed like a final exam Michael had spent months preparing for. He borrowed Robert's combine with hands that shook slightly from nerves disguised as readiness. The first day, he approached the controls like they might explode if he touched them wrong. What if he broke it? What if the yield was terrible? What if Brian had been right and good intentions couldn't overcome inexperience? He took a breath and started cutting. Slowly at first, the combine moved through the corn stalks, disappearing into the machine kernels, streaming into the grain tank. He found the rhythm gradually, confidence building with each pass. The tank filled. He dumped it into the wagon Robert had lent him, hauled it to the elevator in town, got paid real money for something he'd planted, and tended himself. That first check sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he could touch it. When he finally picked it up, his hands were shaking so hard he had to set it down again and just breathe. He harvested for 4 days straight. 4 days of 14-hour shifts of dust and noise, and the constant fear that something would break, or fail, or prove he'd been foolish to try. Laura brought him food in the fields. Robert watched from the yard, nodding approval Michael felt more than saw. George White stopped by on the 3rd day and stood watching the combine work, arms crossed, expression unreadable, until he turned to Michael and said simply, "Jim would be proud." On the 4th evening, Michael finished the last row. 80 acres, every stalk harvested, every kernel accounted for. He drove the combine back to Robert's yard and shut it down, the silence afterward ringing in his ears. He sat in the cab longer than necessary, letting the weight of what he'd done settle into his bones. The numbers came together like pieces of a puzzle, clicking into place. 80 acres yielded 8,960 bushels. Corn was selling at $3.70 per bushel. Gross revenue, $33,152. Subtract seed, cost, fertilizer, fuel, equipment, rental, every expense Michael had tracked obsessively in a notebook that lived in his back pocket. Net profit, $16,400. Michael sat in his truck outside the grain elevator, holding the check, staring at numbers that felt impossible. He'd started with $47 in his pocket 16 months ago. Now he held $16,400, proof that work mattered, that showing up every day mattered, that refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier mattered more than education or connections or family legacy. He didn't drive back to Robert's farm immediately. Instead, he drove to County Road 20, parked in the exact spot where he'd stood with his duffel bag where Edward had left him, with nothing but contempt, and his mother had let it happen. He got out and stood there in the fading light, holding the check, thinking about the boy who'd stood here terrified and alone. "I made it." The words came out, barely audible. "Without you, without any of you." He stood there until the sun touched the horizon. Then he got back in the truck and drove to the farm that had become more home than any house ever had. That night, sitting at Robert's kitchen table with Laura and George, and Robert Michael pulled out his checkbook and wrote the first check he'd ever written. $1,000, made out to Robert Williams, rent for 80 acres, paid in full. He slid it across the table. Robert picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "You did good, kid." Michael nodded, throat too tight for words. Laura's hand found his under the table and squeezed. Later that evening, Michael drove to George's house to drop off Laura. They sat in the truck cab, neither moving, to get out the weight of what had happened, settling between them. "You really did it." Laura's voice held something like wonder. $16,000 on your first harvest. Feels unreal." She turned to face him. "What are you going to do with it?" Michael had been thinking about that since he saw the final numbers. "Save most of it. Buy some equipment. Plant more next year if Robert lets me." "Smart?" She leaned against his shoulder. "Safe. But nothing." She kissed him softly. "I'm proud of you." He watched her walk to the house, waving from the porch before going inside. Then he drove back to the equipment barn, to his cot and his space heater and his corner of Robert's world. He lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about harvest and growth and the strange way success felt both solid and fragile at the same time. The next evening, Michael did something he'd been avoiding for 16 months. He called his mother, used the phone in Robert's kitchen, dialing the number he still knew by heart, listening to it ring 3 times before someone picked up. Edward's voice, flat, annoyed. "Yeah." Michael's mouth went dry. "It's Michael." Silence on the other end, long enough that Michael thought the line had gone dead. Then Edward spoke, voice even colder than Michael remembered. "She doesn't want to talk to you. I just wanted to tell her she doesn't want to talk to you." Each word deliberate, final. Michael heard his mother's voice in the background. "Who is it?" Edward didn't hesitate. "Wrong number." Then he hung up. Michael stood holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling something break and heal simultaneously in his chest. He'd needed to try, needed to reach out with proof that he'd survived and built something worth mentioning. But Edward's rejection had also given him something, permission to stop hoping for acknowledgement that would never come. Laura found him 20 minutes later, still standing by the phone. She didn't ask what happened. She just pulled him into a hug and held on until his breathing steadied. "You don't need their approval." Her voice was fierce against his shoulder. "You have proof. You have $16,000 and 80 acres and a tractor you brought back from the dead. You have people who believe in you. That's enough." Michael nodded against her hair. "You're right." And they stood there in Robert's kitchen as evening turned to night. 2 people learning that family wasn't always blood and home wasn't always where you started. Word count 4,849. Actually, let me continue to reach the minimum. The following week brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made farming feel less like survival and more like purpose. Michael walked his harvested fields, checking for any missed spots, already planning what next season might look like. Robert had hinted at expanding the rental to 160 acres if this year's success held. The math excited and terrified Michael in equal measure. More land meant more risk, but it also meant more proof that he could do this. Laura graduated from her accounting program in early October with honors she downplayed and a job offer from the hospital that paid better than either of them had expected. They celebrated at the diner in town, sitting in a booth, while locals who'd watched Michael grow from outcast to farmer nodded their respect. George joined them, proud of his daughter, in the quiet way fathers show such things, and Robert came too, moving slowly, but determined not to miss it. Over pie and coffee, Robert brought up what he'd been thinking about. Next spring, if you wanted 160 acres. Same terms, 1,000 per 80 acres paid after harvest. Michael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. You trust me with that much? I trust what you proved this year. Robert stirred his coffee. Besides, I'm not getting younger. Having you farm more of my land means I can farm less of it. Helps us both. The calculation ran through Michael's mind instantly. 160 acres at the same yield would gross over $60,000. Net profit, if he managed costs well, could be $32,000, more than he'd made this year, but also more risk if anything went wrong. Weather, pests, equipment failure, market prices dropping. He'd be farming it all with the Farmall H and borrowed equipment. No safety net except the money he'd saved. I'll do it. The words came out certain despite the fear underneath them. Laura's hand found his knee under the table, steadying him. Of course you will. They drove back to the farm with the windows down, despite the cold. Laura's hair whipping in the wind, Michael's mind already working through logistics. He'd need to buy at least one more tractor, used paid in cash, maybe a different planter, more tillage equipment. Every purchase calculated against savings, against risk, against the possibility of failure that lived just beneath the surface of every farmer's confidence. That night, Michael lay on his cot, doing math on paper by lamplight. 16,400 in the bank, 3,000 for a used tractor, 2,000 for a planter, 1,000 for miscellaneous equipment and repairs. Still left 10,000 for emergencies. It was enough, barely but enough, if nothing went catastrophically wrong. And that was the thing about farming that Michael was learning. Everything always threatened to go catastrophically wrong, but you showed up anyway. He finally fell asleep with the lamp still burning, dreams full of green fields and numbers that balanced, and the Farmall H running strong through seasons that hadn't arrived yet, but felt possible in ways they hadn't before. 1975 began with snow that stayed through March and a determination in Michael that felt like armor. He planted 160 acres that spring with borrowed equipment, and the Farmall H working overtime, the old tractor proving what everyone had doubted when they called it junk. The rhythm became meditation. Dawn to dusk on Robert's fields, then his own until dark, made continuing dangerous. Laura brought dinner to wherever he was working, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, while he ate standing up, because sitting down made getting back up harder. The harvest that fall netted $28,000. Michael bought a used 1960 Ford tractor for $1,200 cash from an estate sale, paid Robert his $2,000 in rent, and banked the rest. People in town saw him in the same worn Carhartt jacket, driving the same beat-up Chevy, and assumed he was barely scraping by. Michael let them think what they wanted. Their opinions didn't deposit into his savings account. 1976 brought 240 acres under his management and a profit of $41,000. He bought used tillage equipment, paid cash, negotiated hard. 1977 added another 80 acres and a used John Deere combine for $9,000 that needed work, but nothing Michael couldn't fix himself. That year brought in $53,000 net. By 1978, at 22 years old, Michael was farming 600 acres total and had $94,000 saved in a bank account that felt both real and impossible every time he checked the balance. Robert had stepped back gradually, his body finally admitting what his mind had fought. He couldn't work like he used to. The pneumonia had taken something fundamental, some core strength that didn't return no matter how much he wanted it to. He watched Michael work with satisfaction that went deeper than pride. One evening in late spring, sitting on his porch while Michael finished evening chores, Robert called him over. "It's all yours to farm now. Just pay me $10,000 a year for the 400 acres. The rest you keep." Michael stood at the bottom of the porch steps, processing what that meant. With the 400 acres plus the 600 he was already managing, he'd be running over 1,000 acres by the end of the year. The scale felt enormous and exactly right simultaneously. "I won't let you down." Robert waved that away like it wasn't even a question worth addressing. "I know you won't. That's why I'm doing it." Michael moved out of the equipment barn that summer into a small trailer house Robert helped him buy for $1,000. It cost another $500 to move it onto the property and get it set up. Heat, running water, a kitchen where he could cook instead of eating cold sandwiches, a door that locked. Laura helped him make it livable, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself, organizing the tiny kitchen, turning a metal box into something that felt like home. They'd been seeing each other for 4 years by then. Not officially, not in the way people announced relationships in small towns, just two people who'd become essential to each other's breathing. She worked at the hospital doing accounting, and bookkeeping came to the farm every evening, stayed most nights, though neither of them mentioned that to George, who probably knew anyway. One evening in June, Michael picked her up after her shift and drove out to the field where the Farmall H sat parked at the edge of his rented acreage. The corn was knee-high green, stretching to the horizon in every direction, the evening light turning everything gold. He led her to the tractor, and they climbed up, sitting on the fender together like they had dozens of times before. Michael's hands were shaking slightly. He'd practiced this in his head all week, but now that the moment was here, words felt inadequate. "I don't have much to offer. Just land, I work this tractor, and a promise to show up every single day for you." Laura looked at him with eyes that held everything he needed to know before she spoke. "You had me at, I'm going to fix a broken tractor." He pulled a simple silver band from his pocket, the best he could afford, without touching his savings, and held it out like an offering. "Will you marry me?" "Yes." No hesitation, no conditions, just yes. They married in August at the small Methodist church In Grundy Center, George walked Laura down the aisle. Robert stood as Michael's best man, moving slowly but standing straight. The reception was cake and punch in the church basement, nothing fancy, perfect in its simplicity. They spent their wedding night in the trailer house, falling asleep to the sound of wind through corn, both of them too exhausted from the week's work to stay awake long, but happy in a way that felt earned. Laura moved in officially, though she'd basically been living there already. She kept her job at the hospital, brought home a steady paycheck that meant they weren't entirely dependent on harvest. They fell into the rhythm. Married farmers know work and sleep and stolen moments of tenderness between chores and obligations. Michael kept farming Robert's 400 acres and renting more from neighbors every year. 700 acres, 900, 1,200. Each expansion came only when he knew he could handle it, when the numbers made sense, when taking the risk felt calculated rather than desperate. No shortcuts, no gambling. He upgraded equipment only when the old stuff was beyond repair. He drove the same Chevy until 1984, when the frame cracked and made it dangerous. When he replaced it, the new truck was a used '79 Ford he got for $2,800. He wore Carhartt overalls, bought 3 pairs at a time for $32 each from the farm supply store, rotated them until they were more patches than original fabric. People thought he was broke. Brian Johnson thought he was broke when he visited in December of 1981, arriving in a Mercedes, this time wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than Michael's entire wardrobe. Brian stayed for dinner again, making conversation that felt like reconnaissance. How many acres are you farming now? What's your equipment worth? Have you considered what happens when Uncle Robert passes? The questions had teeth. Michael felt even when Brian smiled, asking them. After Brian left, Laura stood at the sink washing dishes with movements sharp enough to signal anger. He's already counting his inheritance. Michael dried the plates she handed him. Can't stop him from doing that. She turned to face him, water dripping from her hands. What are you going to do when Robert dies, when Brian sells this place? Michael had been thinking about that for years, losing sleep over it, running numbers until his head ached. I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out. He had $130,000 saved by the end of 1981. It felt like a fortune, and nowhere near enough at the same time. January 7th, 1982 arrived with temperatures below zero and news Michael had been dreading since the day he met Robert Williams. The phone rang at 4 in the morning. A neighbor's voice on the other end, quiet and careful. Robert's gone, Michael. Passed in his sleep. I'm sorry. Michael sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in his hand for several minutes after hanging up. Laura put her arms around him from behind, her face pressed against his shoulder. He didn't cry. The grief sat too deep for tears lodged somewhere in his chest that felt carved out and empty. The funeral happened 5 days later. The Methodist church was packed. Farmers Robert had known for decades, neighbors he'd helped through hard times, young farmers he'd given advice to. Michael sat in the front row with Laura and George, listening to people talk about Robert's generosity and fairness and the way he'd built a life through work and integrity. When they asked if Michael wanted to speak, he walked to the front and stood looking at the people who'd come to say goodbye. Robert Williams gave me a chance when I had nothing, no family, no prospects, no reason for anyone to believe in me. He didn't save my life. He gave me the tools to save myself. That's a different kind of gift, harder, more permanent. He sat back down, throat too tight for more words. Laura's hand found his and held on. Brian arrived halfway through the service, slipping into a back pew wearing a black suit that looked expensive enough to signal respect without actually feeling it. At the burial, he stood apart from everyone else, checking his watch twice. At the reception in the church basement, he circulated for exactly 30 minutes before catching Michael alone by the coffee. "We should talk about the farm." Brian's voice carried the professional neutrality lawyers use when delivering bad news. "I know you've been farming the land. That's going to change." Michael's stomach dropped, but his face stayed neutral. "You're selling." "I have to." Brian actually looked regretful, which somehow made it worse. "I've got a law practice in Chicago. Can't run a farm from there. The property's worth about $320,000 at current market rates. I'll put it up for sale after we settle the estate. Should take about 60 days. Michael nodded slowly. "What if I wanted to buy it?" Brian's eyebrows rose. "You me." Brian studied him like he was calculating whether to take the question seriously. "You have that kind of money." Michael met his eyes. "Maybe. What's your bottom line?" $320,000. That's what the appraiser says it's worth. I'll think about it." Brian smiled the way people do when they're being polite about something they don't actually believe. "Sure, you think about it. Let me know." He walked away, already dismissing Michael as a serious buyer. Michael stood there with a paper cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, doing math that didn't work no matter how he arranged the numbers. 130,000 saved, short 190,000. He could borrow from the bank, but that meant putting everything he'd built at risk. He'd promised himself he'd never owe anyone, never be vulnerable to someone else's timeline or terms. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with Laura, papers spread everywhere, numbers that refused to add up correctly. She watched him for an hour before speaking. "How short are we, 190,000? Michael's voice came out flat. "Even if I sold every piece of equipment I own, I'd still be 70,000 short. And then I'd have no equipment to farm with." Laura stood and walked to the bedroom, came back 5 minutes later with a manila envelope Michael had never seen before. She set it on the table between them and pushed it toward him. "Open it." Michael pulled out bank statements. An account in Laura's name, balance $60,000. He looked up at her confused. "When my mom died, she left me money. I was 10. Dad put it in an account for me, said it was for something important." She sat down across from him. "This is important." Michael shook his head. "I can't take your inheritance. You're not taking it." Her voice was firm. "We're investing it together. This land made you who you are. My mother would want her money to build something real. But what if, nothing?" She reached across and took his hands. "This is what married people do. We're a team. Your success is my success. Your risk is my risk." Michael felt something break open in his chest. Not breaking apart, breaking open, making room for the reality that he didn't have to do everything alone anymore. "With your 60,000, I'd have 190 total. Still short 130, so we offer less." Laura pulled a notepad over and started writing. "We offer 195 cash. All of it. Final offer. Take it or leave it." Brian won't go for that. He wants 320. Maybe he wants 320, but what he needs is cash fast and no hassle. Laura underlined the number. Let's find out what he values more. They sat up until 3 in the morning, refining the strategy, making it work on paper. By the time they fell into bed, Michael felt something he hadn't felt since standing on County Road 20. That sense of standing on the edge of everything changing, not knowing if he'd fall or fly. 2 weeks later, Michael called Brian. The lawyer took the call at his office in Chicago. Michael could hear traffic in the background. "I want to make an offer on the farm." Brian's tone shifted to professional. "I'm listening. 195,000. Cash. Close in 7 days. No contingencies. No inspections. No waiting." Silence on the other end. Long enough that Michael thought the line had disconnected. Then Brian spoke, voice careful. "That's 125,000 under asking. It's cash. Today. You can have the money in your account by Friday. No realtor fees. No waiting for buyer financing. No deals falling through." More silence. Michael could hear Brian thinking, could almost see him doing the math. 320,000 minus realtor commission was closer to 300,000. Minus holding costs and waiting time and uncertainty. Minus the hassle of managing a property 8 hours away during an estate sale. "I have another buyer at 280. He needs 60 days to close and financing approval." Michael's heart was hammering, but his voice stayed steady. "So take his offer, or take mine in 7 days." Brian exhaled. "Let me think about it. I'll call you tomorrow." The next day lasted approximately 40 years. Michael tried to work, but kept checking the phone. Laura came home at lunch, and they sat together, not talking, just existing in the same space, while the universe decided their future. The phone rang at 4:30. Brian's voice came through, clipped and professional. 205,000. Cash in 7 days. That's my counter. Michael closed his eyes, ran the numbers. 130,000 his savings, 60,000 Laura's inheritance, 15,000 he could get if he sold his Ford tractor and the used combine. 205,000 exactly. It would wipe him out. He'd own the land, but have almost nothing left for operating costs or emergencies. Deal. The word came out before fear could stop it. "I'll have my lawyer draw up papers. You have your financing lined up." "It's not financing. It's cash I have." Another pause. "You have 205,000 in cash." "Yes." Brian made a sound that might have been respect or disbelief. "Then I'll see you at closing Friday at 2. Michael hung up and turned to Laura. He accepted 205. She kissed him hard, then pulled back. "So now we figure out how to survive owning 400 acres with no money left." They had 3 days to turn assets into cash. Michael sold his Ford tractor to a neighbor for less than it was worth, but fast. The combine went to a young farmer in the next county for 10,000. He kept only the Farmall H and the absolute minimum equipment needed to plant and harvest. Everything else went. Friday at 2 o'clock, Michael and Laura sat in a lawyer's office in Cedar Falls with a cashier's check for $205,000. Brian arrived in his Mercedes, shook hands like this was just business, and signed papers that transferred ownership of 400 acres from Robert Williams's estate to Michael Thompson. When it was done, Brian stood and offered his hand. "You surprised me. I didn't think you had it in you." Michael shook his hand. "Most people don't." Brian walked out, and Michael just stood there, holding the deed, reading his name, typed in legal language, making it official. Laura wrapped her arms around him from behind. "We did it!" "No." Michael turned to face her. "We did it. That night they drove to the farm that was now theirs, parked in the yard, walked the property under stars that seemed brighter than usual, or maybe Michael was just paying attention in a way he hadn't before. He stopped in the middle of a field, knelt down, put both hands in the soil. Laura knelt beside him. "No one can take this away." Michael's voice came out rough. "No one can kick me off my own land." They stayed there until the cold became uncomfortable, then walked back to the trailer house. Their house, on their land. At 26 years old, Michael owned 400 acres free and clear. It felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. June of 1983 brought a wedding at the farm, not Michael's. George White married a widow from Cedar Falls in a small ceremony where Laura served as maid of honor, and Michael stood up as George's best man. Watching George find happiness again reminded Michael that loss didn't have to be permanent, that broken things could heal if given time and care. That fall, Laura told him she was pregnant. Michael stopped breathing for a second, then lifted her off the ground, both of them laughing. They spent the winter converting the trailer's second bedroom into a nursery, buying used furniture, reading books about childbirth that terrified Michael with their detailed descriptions of everything that could go wrong. James Michael Thompson was born on April 3, 1985, at Grundy Hospital. Laura's labor lasted 14 hours. Michael stayed the entire time holding her hand, feeling completely useless and absolutely necessary. When the nurse placed his son in his arms, Michael looked down at this tiny person and felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. He'd named the boy James for his father, Michael for himself, a link to the past and a promise to the future. 2 years later, Emily Thompson arrived with less drama and more certainty. Michael held his daughter and his son and his wife in the hospital room and thought about how far he'd come from standing on County Road 20. How impossible this would have seemed then. How necessary it felt now. 1989 brought enough profit to build a real house. Nothing fancy. 1,600 square feet, 3 bedrooms, simple and solid. They paid $48,000 in cash. Michael dug the foundation himself with borrowed equipment, framed it with help from neighbors who showed up because that's what farmers did. Laura picked out paint colors and cabinet hardware and turned it into a home. That same year, Linda Brown died, Michael's mother. The call came from Jennifer Harris, his half-sister he barely knew, just the facts. Linda had cancer. Linda had fought. Linda had lost. The funeral was in 3 days. Laura found him standing in the barn, staring at nothing. "You should go. She chose Edward over me." Michael's voice was flat. "She let him kick me out, and maybe she regretted it every day after." Laura stepped closer. Maybe she didn't know how to fix it. Maybe she was weak, but she was still your mother. Go say goodbye. The funeral was small. Michael sat in the back of the same Methodist church where Robert's service had been. Edward Harris sat in the front row, older and smaller than Michael remembered. Jennifer and her brother sat beside him. A few distant relatives Michael didn't recognize. The pastor talked about Linda's kindness, her quiet strength, her love for her children. Michael didn't cry. He sat with Laura beside him and thought about the mother who'd stood in the doorway crying while Edward pushed him out, about the woman who'd taught him to read and made his favorite meals and then chose silence when he needed her voice, about forgiveness and anger and how both could be true simultaneously. At the cemetery, Jennifer approached him. "We never really met. I'm Jennifer, your sister, half-sister." Michael kept his voice neutral. She nodded like she'd expected that. "Dad's dying, too. Cancer. He has maybe 6 months." She handed him a piece of paper with a phone number. "If you want to see him, if you want to talk, I understand if you don't." Michael took the number folded. It put it in his pocket. In the car, Laura asked if he was going to call. Michael looked out the window at Iowa farmland rolling past, thinking about grudges and freedom, and whether holding on to anger hurt him more than it hurt Edward. "I don't know yet. He never called. Edward Harris died 8 months later. Michael didn't attend the funeral." Jennifer sent a card. Laura asked if he regretted not going. Michael thought about it honestly before answering. "No. Some doors close for good. That's okay." He focused on his family. On James learning to drive the Farmall H at 8 years old, feet barely reaching the pedals. On Emily reading books in the tractor cab while Michael plowed fields. On Laura doing the farm's books at the kitchen table, balancing accounts, making sure they stayed ahead. By 1990, Michael owned 800 acres, rented another 1,000, had a net worth of $1.4 million. By 2000, he owned 1,400 acres, rented. 1,200 more was worth $2.9 million. He didn't change much. Still worked dawn to dusk during planting and harvest. Still wore Carhartt overalls. Still drove modest trucks. Still helped young farmers when they asked for advice, renting land at fair prices, answering questions, being for them what Robert had been for him. In 2010, a reporter from the Des Moines Register came out to the farm. Young guy, mid-20s, working on a feature about generational farming. He asked about Michael's story. Michael told him. Kicked out at 17 with $47, sleeping in an equipment barn, buying a broken tractor for $100. Learning to farm through work and failure and persistence. The reporter's eyes got wider with each detail. "You went from $47 to being worth over $3 million. How Michael thought about how to answer that, about all the complexity that lived in the gap between those two numbers. "I bought a $100 tractor nobody wanted, fixed it, used it, never stopped working." The article ran 3 weeks later. Front page of the Sunday business section, 2,000 words about grit and determination and what happens when someone refuses to accept the story other people write for them. Letters started arriving, emails, phone calls, young farmers saying they didn't feel so alone anymore, parents saying they'd use his story to teach their kids about perseverance. People Michael had never met thanking him for proving that starting with nothing didn't mean staying there. It makes you wonder, how many people do we give up on too quickly? How many second chances do we deny to others and to ourselves? One letter came from Iowa State University, an invitation to speak at their agricultural college. Michael read it twice, set it aside, picked it up again an hour later. Laura found him staring at it. "You should do it. I'm not a speaker. I'm a farmer. You're both." She kissed his cheek. "Go tell your story to kids who need to hear it." September 15th, 2015. Michael drove the Farmall H to Iowa State's campus. 67 years old now, the tractor's still running strong. He parked it outside the auditorium, red paint, gleaming chrome, reflecting the afternoon sun. 800 students filled the seats. Michael stood at the podium, looking at faces that reminded him of his own at 18, scared, hopeful, not sure they belonged. He told them everything. County Road 20, the $47, Robert Williams, the tractor that had been his father's, the 6 Sundays spent bringing it back to life, the winter in the barn, the first harvest, Laura, The struggle to buy land, all of it. When he finished, he took them outside and showed them the Farmall H. Let them touch it, take pictures, ask questions. One student, a girl maybe 19, raised her hand. What if we fail? Michael looked at her, seeing himself in the question. Then you get back up. Falling isn't failure. Staying down is failure. This tractor taught me everything. Broken things can be fixed. You don't need much to start, just something that works and the willingness to use it. The students lined up to meet him afterward, shook his hand, asked for advice, told him their stories. Michael stayed until the last one left, exhausted but grateful. He drove the tractor home thinking about the kid he'd been standing on County Road 20 and how close he'd come to disappearing. A week later, another letter arrived, this one from the Smithsonian. They were curating an exhibit on American farming history. They wanted to acquire the Farmall H. The offer was $75,000. Michael read the letter 3 times, showed it to Laura. She waited for him to decide. Not for sale. When I'm gone, James can choose. But while I'm alive, it stays with me. She smiled. Good. May of 2018 brought warm weather early, and a visitor Michael hadn't expected. He was working on the Farmall H in the barn when a car pulled into the yard. A woman got out 40s, maybe moving uncertain, like she wasn't sure she should be there. Michael walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you? Are you Michael Thompson?" Her voice shook slightly. "I am. I'm Jennifer Harris, your sister." She took a breath. "I should have reached out sooner. I'm sorry." Michael studied her, seeing features that reminded him of Linda, of Edward, of a past he'd spent decades moving away from. "What can I do for you?" Jennifer reached into her car and pulled out an envelope. "Dad died 3 years ago. Before he died, he wrote you a letter, asked me to give it to you. I was too much of a coward until now." Michael took the envelope, turned it over in his hands. Jennifer waited, giving him space to decide. Finally, he opened it. Edward's handwriting, shakier than Michael remembered, but still recognizable. The letter was short, direct, no excuses dressed up as apologies, just the truth as Edward had finally admitted it to himself. "Michael, you were never not my kid. You reminded me too much of Jim Walker, a better man than I could ever be. I was jealous, angry, weak. Kicking you out was the worst thing I ever did. Your mother never forgave me. We lived together, but she never looked at me the same after that night. I hope you found what you were looking for. I hope you became the man I wasn't. Edward Harris." Michael read it twice, then folded it carefully. Jennifer held out something else, a small box. Inside was a ring, gold band worn smooth inscription on the inside. "J.W. to L.B. forever. Mom kept it, your dad's wedding ring. Dad said you should have it." Michael took the ring, held it up to the light. His father's ring, the one James Walker had worn when he bought the Farmall H in 1948, when he worked the land, when he died too young trying to provide for a family. Michael slipped it onto his finger. "Fit perfectly. Thank you for bringing this." Jennifer nodded. "For what it's worth, I think Dad died regretting most of his life. But you turned out okay despite him, maybe because of him." She started to leave, then turned back. "You did good, Michael." He watched her drive away, then went back into the barn, sat on the Farmall H with his father's ring on his finger and Edward's letter in his pocket. Laura found him there an hour later. "You okay?" "Yeah." Michael looked at the ring, just remembering. She climbed up beside him. They sat in silence, two people who'd built a life from nothing but work and faith, and the refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. James ran the farm now, 33 years old, confident and capable, farming the land like he'd been born knowing how. Emily lived in Cedar Rapids, teaching elementary school, bringing the grandkids out every weekend. Michael helped during planting and harvest when the pressure returned and reminded him who he'd been. The rest of the time, he stepped back, watched, tried to learn how to be still without feeling useless. He still started the Farmall H once a month, not because it needed it, but because he did. The sound never failed to take him back to the shed where dust shook loose from rafters, and a kid who'd been told he didn't matter watched a dead engine come alive under his hands. Spring 2020 brought a granddaughter's 8th birthday. Emily's daughter, curious and fearless, who asked questions about everything. Michael walked with her through fields just planted corn, barely visible yet, but full of promise. She looked up at him with Laura's eyes and Emily's determination. "Grandpa, why do you keep that old red tractor? Everyone says you should put it in a museum." Michael knelt down so they were eye level. "Let me tell you a story about a boy, a road, and $47. He told her everything, the whole truth. When he finished, she hugged him fierce. "I'm glad you didn't give up. Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That evening, Michael and Laura walked their land as the sun set. 74 years had passed since someone bought a Farmall H new from a dealership. 47 years since Michael stood with nothing and decided nothing wasn't good enough. They stopped at the equipment barn, the one where he'd slept that first winter, and looked at the corner that had been home when home was just a cot and a heater. "You ever regret it?" Laura leaned against him. "All the work, all the sacrifice." Michael thought about the question honestly. People ask what success cost me. It cost me my childhood. I grew up at 17 faster than anyone should. It cost me my mother. We never reconciled before she died. It cost me time. But it gave me something more valuable. Proof that broken things can run again. That a kid with $47 and no home can build an empire on faith work and one good tractor. And that's worth everything I lost. They stood together watching the last light fade from the sky. The Farmall H sat in its corner, red paint, perfect engine, ready, 72 years old and still running. Michael thought about all the ways life could break a person and all the ways they could choose to be made whole again. Have you ever taken something broken and refused to give up until it worked again? What did it teach you? Tell us in the comments. Word count 6,447.